1898. Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia. There were places in the mountains where even maps hesitated to reach. Clarion Hollow was one of those places, a narrow valley wedged between peaks shrouded in perpetual mist, where the sun seemed to visit reluctantly and always departed earlier than necessary. In the late 19th century, while the rest of America industrialized and cities grew like hungry organisms, Clarion Hollow remained trapped in its own time. An open wound in the landscape where only the desperate or the forgotten dared to stay. The road cutting through the valley was little more than a trail of packed earth, always damp, always dark. When it rained, and it rained frequently during those autumn months, mud rose to ankle height, and the path transformed into a treacherous serpent, threatening to swallow entire wagons whole. Ancient oaks flanking the trail twisted their branches like arthritic fingers, and their shadows danced in the misty afternoons with an almost conscious quality, almost predatory. It was there, precisely at the tightest bend in the valley, where the road folded upon itself like a cowering creature, that stood the house of cousins Ezra and Delilah Crane. From a distance, the structure appeared to be just another deteriorating wooden cabin, typical of the region. Boards darkened by time, a gabled roof patched with rusted metal sheets, a stone chimney spitting grey smoke even on the warmest days. But there was something about that house, something that made travelers slow their pace when approaching, a quality of watchfulness, as if the structure itself had eyes. The windows, 4 in total, were always covered by heavy curtains, but occasionally, just occasionally, a gap would open. And there, in the damp penumbra of the interior, someone was always watching. The cousins. Ezra Crane was 43 years old that autumn of 1898. He was a tall man, unnaturally so, with a frame that seemed stretched beyond what human proportions should allow. His height, approaching 6 feet 7 inches, made him stoop when entering doorways, giving him a perpetually hunched posture that suggested submission, though his eyes told a different story. Those eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, set deep in a gaunt face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. He never explained where the scar came from, though whispers in nearby towns suggested everything from a mining accident to a knife fight over land disputes. Ezra wore the same clothes day after day, black wool trousers held up by leather suspenders over a dingy white shirt that had long ago surrendered to permanent yellowish stains. His hands were enormous, with fingers like tools, calloused, scarred, always moving. Even when he stood still, his fingers twitched and flexed, as if possessed by their own nervous system. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it revealed teeth too small for his mouth, creating an unsettling childlike quality in his otherwise severe face. But it was Delilah who truly commanded attention. She was 38, though her face could have belonged to someone much older or, in certain lights, disturbingly younger. Delilah possessed that peculiar Appalachian beauty. Sharp cheekbones, skin pale as milk despite years under the mountain sun, and hair so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She kept it long, always braided, the braid hanging down her back like a thick rope reaching past her waist. When she moved, it swayed with a hypnotic rhythm. Her eyes were her most striking feature, one green, one hazel, a condition the locals called witch's mark. In superstitious mountain communities, heterochromia was often seen as evidence of supernatural sight, the ability to see beyond the veil between worlds. Delilah did nothing to discourage such beliefs. In fact, she seemed to cultivate them, the way one might cultivate a useful crop. She dressed always in layers, long skirts in dark fabrics, aprons stained with substances no one cared to identify, shawls wrapped around her shoulders, even in summer heat. Around her neck hung a peculiar necklace made of what appeared to be bird bones and strange dark stones, objects that clicked and rattled when she walked, announcing her presence before she entered a room. The cousins had lived together in that house for 12 years, ever since Ezra's wife had died, or disappeared, depending on which version of the story you heard. They were blood relations, second cousins through their mother's side, and the arrangement, while unconventional, wasn't entirely scandalous by frontier standards. People lived how they needed to live in places like Clarion Hollow. The post-war wound. The Civil War had ended 33 years prior, but its ghost still haunted Appalachia like a fever that refused to break. West Virginia had been born from that conflict, torn from Virginia in a violent Caesarean section of politics and blood. Families had split, brother against brother, and even decades later, certain names weren't spoken in certain households. The economy had never recovered. Mines opened and closed like mouths gasping for air. Timber companies came and went, stripping mountainsides bare before vanishing when the easy money dried up. Men who had survived the war often didn't survive the peace, broken by drink, by violence, by the sheer grinding poverty that defined existence in these forgotten hollows. Clarion Hollow had been slightly more prosperous once, or so the oldest residents claimed. There had been a small lumber operation, a general store, even talk of a church being built. But one by one, families had left. The lumber operation collapsed after a landslide killed 7 men. The store closed when the owner died, and no one wanted to buy it. The church was never built. By 1898, fewer than 30 people called Clarion Hollow home, and most of them were scattered across the hillsides in cabins even more isolated than the Cranes. The nearest real town was Harper's Ridge, 8 miles away over treacherous mountain roads, 2 hours by wagon if conditions were good, impossible if they weren't. This isolation created its own rules, or rather the absence of rules. Out here, law was whatever you could enforce yourself. Sheriffs didn't patrol these roads. Circuit judges rarely ventured this deep into the mountains. If something happened to you in a place like Clarion Hollow, you were on your own. And things had been happening. The rumors begin. It started, as most whispers do, with small observations that accumulated weight through repetition. Thomas Ridley, a traveling peddler who passed through the hollow once every few months, mentioned to folks in Harper's Ridge that he'd seen fresh graves behind the Crane house. 4, maybe 5 new mounds, he'd said over whiskey at the Copper Creek Saloon. Too many for a household of 2 people, unless they're burying something they shouldn't. When asked if he'd inquired about it, Ridley had gone quiet, his weathered face darkening. Didn't seem like the sort of question a man asks if he wants to leave with his throat intact, he'd finally said. Then there was Martha Goins, an elderly woman who lived on the north side of the hollow. She'd stopped going past the Crane house entirely, taking a much longer route around even though it added an hour to any trip. When her daughter asked why, Martha had simply shaken her head. The smell, she'd whispered. When the wind blows right, you can smell it from the road. Like meat gone bad, like death sweetened with herbs to hide the rot. But perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from travelers, the rare souls who'd stopped at the Crane house seeking shelter or a meal. The house, after all, was the only structure directly on the main road, and mountain hospitality was supposed to be sacred. In harsh country, you helped strangers because one day you might be the stranger needing help. Those who knocked on the Crane's door usually found hospitality, but of a peculiar kind. They were always invited in, always offered food, usually a thick, dark stew served in wooden bowls, accompanied by hard bread and weak tea. The meal was free, or nearly so. Ezra and Delilah seemed to want nothing more than company, conversation, news from the outside world. But something about the experience left visitors unsettled. Some complained of feeling watched even when the cousins weren't in the room. Others mentioned the interior of the house, impossibly dark despite lamplight, decorated with strange items hanging from the rafters. Bundles of dried herbs, yes, but also things that looked like dolls made from corn husks and hair, bottles filled with murky liquids, animal skulls arranged in deliberate patterns. And then there were those who mentioned feeling ill after eating the stew. Not immediately. The discomfort came later, sometimes hours down the road. Stomach cramps, fever, vivid dreams that felt more like memories borrowed from someone else's life. By October of 1898, At least 7 people had stopped at the Crane House over the previous 6 months. 7 people who'd shared a meal, expressed gratitude, and continued on their journeys. By October of 1898, 3 of those 7 were dead. The first death, Samuel Pritchard, had been the first. A surveyor from Pittsburgh, passing through on business related to potential mining claims. He'd stopped at the Crane House on a rainy evening in May, stayed for supper, and continued on to Harper's Ridge the next morning. 3 days later, he'd fallen violently ill at a boarding house. The doctor who examined him described symptoms that didn't make sense: extreme fever, convulsions, organ failure that seemed to happen all at once rather than progressively. Pritchard died screaming about shadows with too many fingers. The doctor attributed it to cholera, though he seemed uncertain. Then came Abigail Chen in July, a rare Chinese immigrant traveling to join her husband who worked on the railroad. She'd also stopped at the Crane House, also shared their stew, also died within a week. This time the symptoms were different: paralysis that started in her legs and crept upward, stopping her breathing. The doctor who examined her body found nothing to explain it. The third death was Jacob Trent, a young man barely 20, traveling to see his dying father. He'd stopped at the Crane House in late August. He never made it to his father. Hunters found his body 2 days later, collapsed on the road less than 5 miles from the hollow. His face was frozen in an expression of such pure terror that one of the hunters refused to touch the corpse. 3 deaths, 3 travelers. 3 people who had all shared one common experience: a meal at the house on Forgotten Bend. The investigation that wasn't. When Sheriff Thomas Bradshaw from Harper's Ridge finally heard enough rumors to feel obligated to investigate, he rode out to Clarion Hollow on a cold morning in late September. He brought his deputy, a young man named Elias Cobb, who'd never been to the hollow before. They found the Crane House exactly where it had always been, smoke rising from the chimney, curtains drawn against the morning light. Ezra answered the door. He was polite, if distant. He invited them inside. The interior, Deputy Cobb would later report, was exactly as disturbing as people had described. Dark, despite multiple lamps, crowded with strange objects, permeated by a smell he couldn't quite identify. Sweet, but wrong. Like flowers growing on a grave. Sheriff Bradshaw asked about the deaths, asked about the travelers, asked to see those graves Thomas Ridley had mentioned. Ezra explained everything with perfect reasonableness. The graves, family pets, and a stillborn calf. The travelers? Yes, many people stopped for meals. They tried to be good Christians, offering hospitality to strangers. As for the deaths, tragic, certainly. But what did that have to do with them? People died all the time. The world was dangerous. Disease was everywhere. Delilah appeared from the back of the house, her mismatched eyes fixing on the sheriff with an intensity that made him shift his weight. She offered them tea. She offered them stew, just made fresh this morning. Both men declined. They left within 20 minutes, finding no evidence of wrongdoing, no basis for arrest, no reason to pursue the matter further beyond vague suspicions that wouldn't hold up in any court. But as they rode away, Deputy Cobb made a note in his journal, a note he'd show to others in the coming weeks. He wrote, "The house feels wrong. The cousins feel wrong. Everything about that place feels like a held breath before a scream. Something is happening there, something terrible. But I don't know how to prove what I can feel in my bones." The present moment. Now it was early October, and the air had turned cold. The leaves on those ancient oaks had begun their transformation into crimson and gold, though in Clarion Hollow the colors seemed muted, less vibrant, as if even autumn couldn't fully express itself here. Smoke rose from the Crane House chimney, thick and dark against the gray sky. Inside, Ezra was sharpening knives, a task he performed every evening with ritualistic precision. The sound of blade against whetstone filled the kitchen with a rhythmic whisper. Shh, shh, shh. Delilah was at the stove, stirring a large iron pot. The contents bubbled slowly, releasing steam that carried that same sweet-wrong smell throughout the house. She hummed as she worked, an old hymn, though the melody was somehow off, the notes bent in ways that made it sound less like worship and more like summoning. On the table between them sat a ledger, handwritten entries in careful script dating back years, names, dates, brief descriptions. And next to some entries, small notations in a code only the cousins understood. The most recent entry had been made just that morning. Margaret Ashby, widow, traveling to sister in Kentucky, arrived evening of October 2nd, stayed for supper, departed morning of October 3rd, condition, satisfactory. Beneath that, in Delilah's more elaborate handwriting, a single word had been added. Suitable. Outside, the first drops of evening rain began to fall. The road through Clarion Hollow grew darker, slicker, more treacherous. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, a wagon was approaching. Inside it, a family of 4, parents and 2 young children, seeking shelter from the coming storm. They had heard nothing about the Crane house. They knew nothing about the deaths. They saw only what any traveler would see, a house with light in the windows, smoke from the chimney, the promise of warmth and hospitality in a cold, unforgiving wilderness. They would arrive within the hour. Delilah looked up from her pot, her mismatched eyes catching the lamplight. She smiled, not with malice, not with cruelty, but with the simple satisfaction of someone who knows their work is about to continue. "Ezra," she said softly, her voice carrying that strange musical quality that made even simple words sound like incantations. "We'll need more bowls. Set out the good ones. We're having guests for dinner." The knife in Ezra's hand paused mid-stroke. He lifted his head, listening to something only he could hear. Then slowly, that disturbing, child-toothed smile spread across his gaunt face. "How many?" he asked. "4, Delilah replied, stirring the pot one more time. A proper family meal. The rain fell harder, the road grew darker, and in the house on Forgotten Bend, the table was being set for guests who would eat well, express gratitude, and continue their journey into whatever waited for them in the days ahead. The stew bubbled, the knives gleamed, and somewhere in the darkness between the mountains, death sharpened its appetite and prepared to feast once more. End of Chapter 1. The Ashby family arrived as darkness swallowed the valley whole. Robert Ashby was 36, a furniture maker from Charleston with calloused hands and honest eyes. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him on the wagon bench, 32 years old, thin from recent illness, wrapped in a wool shawl that did little against the October cold. In the back, huddled under canvas tarps, their children shivered. Emma, age 8, and little Thomas, barely 6, his face still round with that vanishing softness of early childhood. They'd left Charleston 3 days prior, heading to Margaret's sister's home in Kentucky, where they hoped the mountain air might help her persistent cough. The journey had been harder than anticipated. A broken wheel outside of Harper's Ridge had cost them a full day and most of their traveling money. Now, with night falling and the temperature dropping, the warm glow from the Crane house windows looked like salvation itself. Robert pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see movement, shadows passing behind the curtains like fish in murky water. "Wait here," he told Margaret, squeezing her hand. "Let me see if they'll take us in." He climbed down from the wagon, his boots sinking into mud that seemed eager to hold him in place. The rain had intensified, each drop striking his hat with insistent percussion. He approached the door, raised his fist to knock. The door opened before his knuckles made contact. Ezra Crane stood in the doorway, impossibly tall, his frame filling the space like a standing coffin. The lamplight behind him created a halo effect that somehow made him appear more sinister rather than angelic. His colorless eyes took in Robert with an expression that might have been assessment or appetite. It was impossible to distinguish which. "Evening," Ezra said, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large man. Terrible night to be on the road. "Yes, sir," Robert replied, removing his hat despite the rain. "My name's Robert Ashby. I've got my wife and 2 young ones in the wagon. We're traveling to Kentucky, but the weather's turned against us. I was hoping, that is, I was wondering if you might have space in your barn or even just—" "Come inside," Ezra interrupted, stepping back. "All of you. We don't turn away families in need." Relief flooded through Robert with such intensity it nearly brought tears to his eyes. "That's mighty Christian of you, sir. Mighty Christian. We can pay—" "No need." Ezra's thin smile appeared, those small teeth catching the light. "Hospitality is its own reward. Bring your family in. My cousin's preparing supper." Within minutes, the Ashbys were inside, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor of the front room. Margaret held Thomas close while Emma pressed against her mother's side, her wide eyes taking in the strange interior with a child's unfiltered perception. She saw the bundles hanging from the rafters, the peculiar objects arranged on shelves, the darkness that seemed to pool in the corners despite multiple lit lamps. "Mama," Emma whispered, tugging her mother's sleeve. "Those dolls are looking at us." "Hush, child," Margaret replied, though she too had noticed the corn husk figures suspended from the ceiling, their empty faces somehow oriented toward the door, toward the new arrivals. Delilah emerged from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the family, something flickered across her mismatched eyes. Pleasure, perhaps, or hunger, barely disguised as welcome. "Oh, you poor dears," she said, her voice carrying that musical wrongness. "Soaked to the bone. Come closer to the fire. Children, let me take those wet coats." She moved toward them with a grace that seemed practiced, rehearsed. Her long braid swayed, and the bone necklace rattled its soft percussion. Emma shrank back, but Delilah's hands were already reaching, already touching, already drawing them deeper into the house. The meal. The dining table was set with surprising care. Wooden bowls, tarnished spoons, cups that might have been fine china once, but were now chipped and crazed with age. The children were given seats closest to the fire, a gesture that seemed kind until one realized it positioned them with their backs to the room's only exit. Delilah brought out the stew in a large iron pot, its contents thick and dark, studded with what appeared to be chunks of meat and root vegetables. The smell was complex, savory and herb-laden, with an underlying sweetness that Margaret couldn't quite identify. It reminded her of something from childhood, some half-remembered feast, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. "I hope you don't mind simple fare," Delilah said, ladling generous portions into each bowl. "We live plainly out here, but what we have, we share." "It smells wonderful," Robert said truthfully. His stomach had been complaining for hours. "Doesn't it, Margaret?" Margaret nodded, though something about the stew made her hesitate. It was too perfect, too generous. In her experience, people who lived this remotely, this poorly, didn't share such abundance without reason. But Robert was already eating, and the children were hungry, and what choice did they have? They were guests, and refusing hospitality was its own form of insult. She picked up her spoon and began to eat. The stew was delicious, rich and complex, with flavors that seemed to unfold in layers. Wild game, herbs she couldn't name, something almost floral in the finish. Despite her suspicions, Margaret found herself eating quickly, scraping the bowl nearly clean. The children ate with equal enthusiasm, even little Thomas, who was usually picky about his food. Throughout the meal, Ezra and Delilah maintained a steady stream of conversation. They asked questions about Charleston, about the furniture business, about the journey. They seemed genuinely interested, leaning forward with attention that felt both flattering and invasive. But it was the things they didn't say that bothered Robert. They offered no information about themselves. When he asked how long they'd lived here, Delilah simply smiled and said, "Oh, long enough." When Margaret inquired about other neighbors, Ezra's response was vague. Folks come and go. And there was the ledger. Robert noticed it on the sideboard, a leather-bound book with pages that looked well used. At one point, when Delilah stood to bring more bread, he saw her glance at it, saw her exchange a look with Ezra that carried meaning he couldn't interpret. Emma had stopped eating halfway through her bowl. She sat very still, staring at something above the table. Following her gaze, Robert saw nothing but the bundles of herbs and the strange hanging objects. "Emma?" he prompted. "Aren't you hungry, sweetheart?" "The dolls are still watching," she whispered. "And they're smiling now." "That's enough," Margaret said, more sharply than intended. "Apologize to our hosts for being rude." But Delilah laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from bone. "Children see things we've forgotten how to see," she said, reaching across to pat Emma's hand. "Nothing wrong with that, dear. Nothing wrong at all." Her touch lingered a moment too long. When she pulled her hand away, Emma's skin showed a brief red mark where the fingers had pressed, as if Delilah's hand had been burning hot. The night. They were given pallets in a back room, a small space with a single window covered by a heavy curtain. The accommodations were better than the barn, certainly better than sleeping in the wagon, but the room felt oppressive. The air was too thick, too warm, despite the cold rain outside. And there was that smell again, the sweet, wrong smell that permeated the entire house. Robert lay beside Margaret, listening to the children's breathing as they settled into sleep. Thomas dropped off quickly, exhausted from the journey. Emma took longer, tossing and turning, occasionally whimpering as if caught in bad dreams. "Robert," Margaret whispered, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I don't like this place." "I know," he admitted. "But what choice did we have? Tomorrow we'll leave early, be in Kentucky by nightfall. That stew was probably just wild turkey or venison, mountain food. We're not used to it." But even as he said it, Robert felt the lie of it. The meat had tasted like nothing he'd eaten before. The texture had been strange, too tender, too fine-grained. And there had been so much of it. How did two people living alone come by such abundance? He thought of the graves Thomas Ridley had mentioned. He thought of the deaths, 3 travelers, all stopping here, all dying within days. The sheriff had investigated and found nothing. But what did that prove? How do you investigate what you can't see? How do you arrest what leaves no evidence? Beside him, Margaret's breathing had become labored. Her cough, dormant for days, had returned with increased intensity. Each breath rattled in her chest like stones in a tin can. "Margaret?" Robert sat up, alarmed. "Are you all right?" She couldn't answer. The coughing seized her, violent and deep, her body convulsing with each spasm. Robert reached for the water bucket, but in the darkness his hand knocked it over, sending water spreading across the floor. The door opened. Delilah stood silhouetted in the doorway, a lamp in her hand, her shadow stretching behind her like something separate and alive. "I heard distress," she said, entering without invitation. "Let me help." She knelt beside Margaret, placing one hand on her forehead, the other on her chest. She began to hum, that same off-key hymn from earlier, and gradually, impossibly, Margaret's coughing subsided. Her breathing eased. Color returned to her face. "There now," Delilah whispered, her mismatched eyes catching the lamplight. "Rest is what you need. Deep, peaceful rest." She stood, and in the lamplight Robert saw something that made his blood freeze. On Delilah's apron, just visible in the fold of fabric, was a stain. Dark red. Recent. And beneath the smell of herbs and cooking, he caught something else. The copper tang of fresh blood. "Sleep well," Delilah said, backing toward the door. "Tomorrow is another day. Tomorrow, everything will be clearer." The door closed. Darkness returned. And in that darkness, Robert lay awake, his mind racing through terrible possibilities he didn't want to name. Beside him, Margaret had already fallen into a sleep that seemed less like rest and more like surrender. In the morning, he told himself. In the morning we leave no matter what. But morning was still hours away, and in a house like this, hours could contain multitudes. The discovery. Robert couldn't sleep. The room was too warm, his mind too active, and somewhere deep in his gut, instinct screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Around 2 a.m, judging by the quality of darkness, he carefully extracted himself from the pallet and crept toward the door. The house was silent except for the settling sounds of old wood and the distant murmur of rain. A single lamp burned low in the main room, casting barely enough light to navigate by. Robert moved carefully, avoiding the creaking boards he'd noted earlier. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Evidence? Confirmation of fears he couldn't articulate? Or perhaps just a glass of water and a moment to breathe air that didn't taste of herbs and secrets? The ledger on the sideboard drew him like a lodestone. He knew he shouldn't look. Knew that reading someone's private records was a violation of hospitality, of trust. But his hand was already reaching, already opening the leather cover. The pages were filled with entries dating back years. Names he didn't recognize, dates, brief notes. But as he read, a pattern emerged that made his stomach clench with horror. James Whitmore, merchant, May 14th, 1896. Stayed 1 night, departed healthy. Died May 19th, 1896, reported by Harper's Ridge physician. Symptoms: fever, convulsions, organ failure. Sarah Hobbs, teacher, August 3rd, 1896. Stayed for supper, departed healthy. Died August 10th, 1896. Symptoms: paralysis, respiratory failure. Nathan Cross, prospector, November 22nd, 1896. Stayed 2 nights, departed healthy. Died November 28th, 1896. Symptoms: madness, self-inflicted wounds, heart failure. Page after page. Dozens of names, dozens of deaths, each one occurring within days or weeks of staying at this house. And beside each entry, in what must be Delilah's handwriting, were notes that made Robert's hands shake. Essence collected. Duration, 6 days. Quality, adequate. Essence collected. Duration, 7 days. Quality, excellent. Essence collected. Duration, 5 days. Quality, poor. Subject, had weak constitution. The most recent entry was dated October 2nd, yesterday. Ashby family, 4 subjects. Father, mother, 2 children. Duration estimate, 4 to 7 days. Quality, children excellent, mother fair, father adequate. Robert's vision blurred. He gripped the sideboard to keep from falling. They knew. They'd known since the moment the family arrived. This wasn't hospitality, it was harvesting. But what were they collecting? What did essence mean? A sound from the kitchen, soft but distinct, made him freeze. Someone was moving in there. Through the partially open door he could see flickering light, could hear soft voices speaking in tones too low to distinguish words. He should run, should wake Margaret and the children, should flee into the rain and take his chances on the road. But his feet carried him forward instead, drawn by the terrible need to understand what was happening in this house of horrors. He pressed himself against the kitchen doorframe and looked inside. What he saw would haunt him until his last breath, which he realized in that moment might come sooner than he'd ever imagined. In the kitchen, illuminated by the iron stove's hellish glow and half a dozen black candles arranged in a pattern Robert's mind refused to fully process, Ezra and Delilah Crane were working. On the large wooden table lay something that had once been human. Robert couldn't tell if it was male or female, couldn't determine age or identity, because the body had been reduced to its essential components in a way that suggested both butchery and ritual. The torso was opened, ribs spread like the pages of a book, and Delilah's hands, gloved in leather stained so dark it was almost black, were extracting something that glowed with a faint, sickly phosphorescence. It looked like light given substance, like spider silk made from moonbeams and suffering. She pulled it out in long, careful strands, winding it around her fingers before transferring it to glass jars that lined the counter. Dozens of them, each containing similar strands of luminous material in varying shades from pale white to deep crimson. The essence fades quickly after death, Delilah was saying, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing a recipe. We've got maybe another hour before this batch loses potency. Ezra was grinding something in a mortar. Herbs, certainly, but also other things Robert recognized from the hanging bundles. And things he didn't recognize. Things that might have been dried insects. Things that might have been worse. The children's will be the purest, Ezra replied, his huge hands working the pestle with surprising delicacy. Children always are, untainted by doubt, by cynicism. Their life force burns cleaner, brighter. 7 days, Delilah mused, holding one of the glowing strands up to the candlelight. Maybe 8, if the mother's constitution proves stronger than expected. The father will go first. He's already suspicious, already fighting the binding. His essence will be bitter, but usable. Robert's legs nearly gave out. They weren't just killing people. They were doing something far worse, harvesting their life force, their very existence, and preserving it in those jars like preserves for winter. And the stew. God help him, the stew. Understanding crashed over him with the weight of a collapsing mountain. The meat in the stew hadn't been turkey or venison. It had been those who came before. The travelers, the merchants, the teachers. Their physical bodies rendered into food, their essence extracted and stored, and then fed to the next victims. The cycle was perfect. Eat the flesh of the dead, become bound to the house, to whatever dark force the cousins served. The essence they extracted wasn't just life force, it was a harvest. They were farming human souls. A floorboard creaked beneath Robert's foot. Delilah's head snapped toward the door with inhuman speed. Her mismatched eyes locked onto his with the intensity of a predator spotting prey. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Robert pressed against the doorframe. Delilah with her hands full of stolen light. Ezra already reaching for one of the knives that hung above the table. Then Delilah smiled. That terrible, knowing smile. "Mr. Ashby," she said softly. "You're up late. Couldn't sleep?" Robert ran. He bolted back toward the bedroom, his heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. Behind him, he heard movement, fast, purposeful, the sound of 2 people who'd done this hunt many times before. He burst into the bedroom. "Margaret, wake up! Get the children! We have to—" But Margaret wasn't moving. Neither were the children. They lay on the pallets, breathing softly, evenly, their faces peaceful despite Robert shaking them, screaming their names, trying desperately to wake them from whatever unnatural sleep held them. The stew. It had been in the stew. Some drug, some poison, some charm that bound them to sleep, while Robert, who'd eaten less, who'd been too nervous to finish his bowl, remained conscious enough to discover the truth. Ezra filled the doorway, his tall frame blocking any escape. In his hand was a cleaver that caught the lamplight with an edge that looked sharp enough to split atoms. "Should have eaten more," Ezra said, almost regretfully. "Would have made this easier for everyone." Robert grabbed the only weapon available, the small oil lamp on the side table. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with terror. "I'll burn this whole goddamned house down." "No, you won't," Delilah said, appearing beside Ezra like smoke taking shape. "Because that would kill your family too. The binding has taken root. They're part of the house now, part of us. They'll sleep for days while their essence ripens and then we harvest," Ezra finished, "as we've always harvested, as we'll continue to harvest until the debt is paid." "What debt?" Robert demanded, backing toward the window, knowing it was covered by a curtain, but hoping, praying for any escape. "What are you?" Delilah's expression shifted then, from predatory pleasure to something that might have been pain, might have been regret. When she spoke, her voice carried centuries of weariness. "We were like you once," she said. "Young, foolish. We made a deal we didn't understand. In 1886, when Ezra's wife was dying of fever, we sought help from an old woman who lived even deeper in these mountains. She gave us a cure, but the price—" Her voice caught. "The price was service. Forever service. We feed the thing that lives beneath this house. We feed it essence, life force, the distilled existence of the living. In return, it keeps us alive, keeps us young, chains us to this place until we can pay back what we owe." "How many?" Robert whispered. "How many have you killed?" "We don't keep count," Ezra said flatly. "Does the farmer count every stalk of wheat?" Robert hurled the lamp. It arced through the air, trailing oil, struck the wall beside Ezra's head, and exploded into flames. The old wood caught immediately, hungry and eager. Within seconds, the doorway was a curtain of fire. But Ezra and Delilah didn't retreat. They walked through the flames as if they were mere inconvenience, their clothes smoking but not igniting, their skin blistering but healing almost as fast as it burned. "The house protects us," Delilah said, her voice carrying over the roar of spreading fire. "It won't let us die. Not until the debt is paid." Robert grabbed Margaret, trying to drag her toward the window, but she was impossibly heavy, as if gravity itself had increased its claim on her. The same with the children. When he tried to lift Thomas, the boy might as well have been made of lead. "The binding," Delilah explained, as smoke began to fill the room. "They belong to the house now." "You can't take them." "Then I'll die here with them," Robert screamed. "No," Ezra said, grabbing Robert with those huge hands and lifting him as if he weighed nothing. "You get to live. You get to spread the story. You get to warn others. Though they never listen. They never do." Robert fought, but it was like fighting a mountain. Ezra carried him through the burning house, through rooms that should have been impassable with flame, but somehow remained traversable, and finally threw him out the front door into the mud and rain. "Tell everyone," Ezra called over the sound of the fire. "Tell them about the house on Forgotten Bend. Tell them about the cousins who serve stew. Tell them all their clever warnings. It won't matter. People always stop. They always eat. And we always harvest." The door slammed shut. Robert crawled through the mud, his mind shattered, his heart torn from his chest. He tried to reach the door, tried to break through, but the flames were too intense now. The entire structure was being consumed. And then, impossibly, the screaming started. Not Margaret or the children. They remained silent, sleeping through their own immolation. But from beneath the house, from the ground itself, came a sound that no human throat could produce. A howling of hunger satisfied, of ancient appetite feeding. The house collapsed in on itself with a roar that shook the valley. Sparks rose into the rain like dying stars. And for just a moment, just a single terrible moment, Robert saw something beneath where the foundation had been. Something vast and pale and writhing, something with too many mouths opening in symphony to consume the essence being released by the burning dead. Then darkness, then nothing. Epilogue. The truth that no one believes Sheriff Bradshaw found Robert 3 days later, wandering the road near Harper's Ridge, his mind fractured into pieces that would never quite fit back together. He told his story to anyone who would listen, the sheriff, the doctor, the newspaper editor, even the circuit judge when he finally came through. No one believed him. A search of the Crane property found only ruins and ash. 4 bodies were recovered from the debris, identified through dental records and personal effects as the Ashby family. The coroner ruled it an accidental fire, probably caused by an overturned lamp. Of Ezra and Delilah Crane, there was no sign, no bodies, no remains, nothing but ash and memory. Robert spent the rest of his short life in an asylum near Wheeling, where he died in 1903, still screaming warnings about the house on Forgotten Bend, about the stew that damns, about cousins who harvest souls. But here's what the records don't say. Here's what the historians and researchers who've combed through Appalachian archives have discovered but can't quite explain. Between 1886 and 1898, at least 37 travelers died under mysterious circumstances within days of passing through Clarion Hollow. The pattern stopped after the fire. Completely. For exactly 12 years. Then, in 1910, a new house was built on that same plot of land. Different owners this time, a brother and sister named Tobias and Ruth Grantham. They were hospitable folks, always ready to share a meal with travelers, especially their specialty, a rich, dark stew that guests praised as the best they'd ever tasted. Between 1910 and 1932, 23 travelers died mysteriously within days of visiting that house. The house burned in 1932. The Granthams vanished. In 1944, another house rose on Forgotten Bend. Different owners again, different names, same stew. The pattern repeats every time someone tries to build there. Every time, the new residents are hospitable, generous, and fond of serving stew. Every time, travelers die. Every time, when authorities finally investigate, the house burns and the residents disappear. The last recorded incident was in 1998, 100 years to the day after Robert Ashby lost his family. A couple named Porter claimed they'd barely escaped from hosts who served them poisoned food. Their story was dismissed as hysteria caused by food poisoning. That house burned too. The Porters survived, but like Robert before them, no one believed their warnings. Today, if you drive through what's left of Clarion Hollow, and few people do, as better roads have bypassed the area entirely, you'll find nothing but forest reclaiming what was once settled land. The road through Forgotten Bend is barely passable, more suggestion than path. But sometimes, in certain lights, you can still see the foundation stones of that original house. Still see the graves that Thomas Ridley mentioned all those years ago, though time and weather have erased whatever markers once identified the dead. And sometimes, if you're foolish enough to stand on that ground when twilight comes, you can smell it. Beneath the loam and decay, beneath the scent of pine and mountain laurel, there's something else. Something sweet and wrong. The smell of meat cooking, of herbs and spices masking rot, of hospitality hiding hunger. The debt, it seems, has never been paid. The harvest continues, patient and eternal, waiting for the next fool to build on cursed ground, waiting for the next traveler to knock on a door they should have passed by, waiting for the next family to accept a bowl of stew from smiling hosts who see them not as guests, but as crops ready for reaping. The Appalachian mountains hold many secrets in their ancient folds. Most are simply forgotten. Some are best left undisturbed. But the house on Forgotten Bend, that secret refuses to stay buried. It rises again and again, wearing different faces, speaking different names, but always serving the same purpose. Always harvesting, always feeding, always waiting, and the stew is always delicious. The end.